The Dyer family had lived on the outskirts of their small Tennessee town for as long as anyone could remember. Their estate, an old sprawling house with overgrown ivy creeping along its walls, seemed more like a relic of the past than a home in the present. To the townsfolk, the Dyers were the quiet ones, the recluses who kept to themselves and rarely ventured into the town square. The father, Charles Dyer, worked as a carpenter and was known for his skill with wood. His wife, Lydia, was a woman of strong faith, often seen at the local church on Sundays, her devout prayers the talk of the pews. Their two children, Matthew and Hannah, had grown up in isolation, but their behavior was nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, they seemed like the picture of normalcy. They were respectful to their neighbors, kept their yard tidy, and the town had come to accept them as part of its quiet rhythm, an oddity to be sure, but harmless. Then one evening, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. The envelope, addressed in jagged, hurried handwriting, contained nothing but a single line. The Dyer cellar hides more than just wood. The sheriff, a man of steady nerves, had seen his share of strange occurrences, but this was different. The anonymous tip struck a chord in him, a sense of urgency and danger he couldn't ignore. When he arrived at the Dyer estate, the air around the house seemed heavy, oppressive, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Charles greeted him at the door as calm and friendly as ever, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something hidden beneath the surface, that the sheriff couldn't quite place. "Afternoon, Sheriff. What brings you to our neck of the woods?" Charles asked, his voice steady, too steady, as if rehearsed. The sheriff explained that he was there on a routine check, just following up on an anonymous tip. Charles seemed unperturbed, too unbothered. "Of course, Sheriff. You're welcome to look around," he said, stepping aside to let him enter. They walked through the dimly lit house, the faint smell of wood polish and something else, something faintly sour, lingering in the air. The children, Matthew and Hannah, were nowhere to be found, and Lydia, who usually sat by the hearth, was absent. It was almost as if the house was empty, even though the family was there. The sheriff's eyes lingered on the family portraits hanging on the walls, dull faces, all smiles, but something about their eyes didn't seem quite right. Too still. Too blank. The cellar door was located at the end of a narrow hallway, its entrance barely visible behind a stack of firewood. Charles followed him down without a word, his footsteps echoing in the dark silence. The stairwell was steep, each step creaking underfoot. When they reached the bottom, the sheriff's breath caught. There in the middle of the cold stone floor were 14 coffins, newly sealed, their wooden surfaces polished to a sickening shine. They looked out of place in the cellar, surrounded by the usual tools and firewood, as if someone had placed them there as an afterthought. But it wasn't the coffins that sent a shiver through the sheriff's spine. It was the markings on each one. Strange symbols carved deep into the wood, twisted and arcane, as if they had been made with purpose, not by the hand of a simple carpenter. The symbols were unlike anything the sheriff had ever seen, and their meaning felt wrong, like they were meant to bind something or someone to an unseen force. "What are these?" the sheriff asked, his voice betraying the unease creeping into his chest. Charles, standing just behind him, gave a faint smile. "My family's business," he said calmly, though his words hung in the air like a warning. "These are just preparations, nothing to concern yourself with." But the sheriff could see it in Charles's eyes now. That flicker, the one that wasn't quite fear but something darker, something dangerous. "I'll need to inspect these further," the sheriff said, his voice firm now. But as he moved toward the coffins, Charles stepped in front of him, blocking the path. "You're welcome to come back tomorrow," Charles said, his tone slipping from cordial to something more insistent. The sheriff hesitated, feeling a cold sweat creep across his skin. It wasn't just the coffins that made his heart race now. It was the quiet tension between him and Charles, the hidden hostility behind the calm facade. But before the sheriff could say another word, the sound of footsteps echoed from the top of the stairs. Matthew and Hannah stood in the doorway, their eyes wide, their faces pale as they watched the sheriff with something that almost resembles fear. No, it wasn't fear. It was something colder. It was the look of people who had long understood the dangers lurking in their own home. As the sheriff took a step forward, something shifted in the room. It was subtle at first, but the air grew thicker, suffocating as if the house itself was closing in around him. And suddenly, he understood. He wasn't just in a house, he was in a tomb built to keep something inside, something far worse than any secret. The sheriff stood still for a long moment, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The Dyer family, devout, hard-working, and respected, were not the innocent people they seemed. And the cellar, with its 14 sealed coffins, was not a place for keeping wood. It was a place for keeping the dead, or something worse, something that had been buried for far too long. The sheriff didn't sleep that night. The image of those coffins haunted him, the strange symbols carved into their polished wood seared into his mind. The next morning he arrived at the Dyer estate early, his deputy Jacob in tow. The air was thick with suspicion, and the quiet of the house seemed even more unnerving in the daylight. Charles had disappeared into the far reaches of the property, his absence as noticeable as his presence had been the day before. As they descended into the cellar once more, the oppressive stillness of the space seemed to swallow them whole. The air was dank and heavy with a strange mustiness, as though the room itself had not breathed in years. The coffins were exactly where they had been left, lined up in a neat row. But as the sheriff approached them this time, he could feel the weight of the secret they held growing heavier. Jacob moved beside him, his breath shallow, as if he too could sense that something was terribly wrong. The sheriff knelt beside the first coffin, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been hoping that he was wrong, that the sense of unease he felt the day before was nothing more than an overactive imagination. But as his fingers brushed the edge of the lid, he felt it, a coldness that seemed to seep through the wood, as though the very air inside the coffin had frozen over. He motioned for Jacob to help him, and together they pried the lid open. The sight that greeted them made both men stagger back. The body inside was not the familiar weathered face of an elderly townsperson as they had expected. Instead, the corpse was that of a young woman, pale, thin, her hair matted with dark clumps as though it had been torn from her scalp. Her face was twisted in an expression of pure terror, her eyes wide, mouth agape as if she had died mid-scream. The sheriff swallowed hard, the bile rising in his throat. She had been placed in the coffin unnaturally, her arms bent behind her, her legs twisted at angles that no living body should ever endure. It was as though she had been forced into the coffin while still alive, her body contorted in the agony of her final moments. "Jesus Christ," Jacob whispered, stepping back, his voice thick with horror. The sheriff nodded, his eyes still fixed on the woman's lifeless form. But the more he looked, the more he saw. It wasn't just the way her body had been arranged. It was the marks on her skin, the faint ritualistic symbols carved into her flesh. They were like the ones on the coffin, strange and foreign, twisting in ways that made the sheriff's stomach churn. Whoever had done this had been meticulous, as though they had followed a dark, ancient guidebook. He moved to the next coffin, his hands trembling slightly as he pried the lid open. Inside was another body, this one a man, younger than the woman, his face just as contorted in death. His fingers were curled into fists, his nails broken and bloody as though he had tried to claw his way out of his own coffin in desperation. His chest was bare, and the sheriff could see the faint outline of what appeared to be a ritualistic symbol burned into the skin. The man's mouth was open in a final silent scream, his eyes wide, the terror of his death still evident even in the stillness of the room. The sheriff's hands clenched into fists. This was no accident. These were not the bodies of people who had died peacefully in their sleep. These were the remains of people who had suffered, who had been tortured, possibly over a long period of time, and each of them had been subjected to a cruelty that defied explanation. Jacob stood beside him, his face ashen. "Do you think they did this to them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. He didn't need to speak to know the truth. The Dyer family had been hiding something dark beneath their calm, innocent facade, something twisted that went beyond what either of them could have imagined. This wasn't just a case of murder. It was a ritual, a series of gruesome, methodical sacrifices meant to serve an unknown, horrifying purpose. The sheriff stood up slowly, his gaze sweeping over the rows of coffins. There were more bodies, more victims waiting to be uncovered. But with each discovery, the horrifying truth was becoming clear. The Dyer family had been keeping more than just secrets. They had been keeping death itself locked in their cellar, in the form of those who had been marked and tortured for reasons only they knew. And he feared that this was only the beginning. The sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that the answers he needed were buried somewhere in the past, buried beneath decades of silence, behind the false image of the Dyer family's normalcy. He spent the next few days digging through old town records, talking to those few who had known the family when they first arrived. The more he learned, the more his skin crawled. Lydia Dyer had always been a figure of oddity, even in the early years of her marriage to Charles. She had no family to speak of, no past that anyone could recall with any certainty. Her origins were a mystery, and she had made sure it stayed that way. The townsfolk remembered her as a quiet, elderly woman who kept to herself, too quiet, too withdrawn for someone living among so many. But there were whispers. Whispers that Lydia wasn't always the kindly, prayerful widow she appeared to be. They spoke of strange rituals she performed late at night, always when the moon was full and always near the edge of the dark woods that bordered the Dyer estate. A few had seen her out there, walking along the tree line as though she were searching for something or someone. Some said they had heard her chant softly, her words lost to the wind, while the woods around her seemed unnaturally still. Others recalled her disappearance for days at a time, returning with a wild look in her eyes, as if she had crossed into something far beyond her own understanding. The sheriff wasn't sure what to believe, but the more he learned, the more it became clear that Lydia Dyer was no ordinary recluse. There was something darker beneath her calm exterior, something the family had been hiding for years. He took the stories to Jacob, hoping that his deputy's steady mind would help him make sense of it all. "Do you think Lydia was behind all of this?" Jacob asked, looking over the records with a furrowed brow. "The bodies, the coffins. It's like they were all waiting for something." The sheriff didn't answer right away. His gut told him that Lydia had been more than just a participant. She had been the catalyst, the one who had begun the rituals that now defined the Dyer family. But what exactly had driven her to this twisted path? What had she been after all these years? The sheriff's next lead came from an old neighbor, a woman who remembered a young girl named Clara, taken in by the Dyers decades ago. Clara had come to them as an orphan, a child from a nearby town who had been left with no one to care for her after her parents died in a mysterious accident. The Dyers, kind-hearted at the time, took her in. But Clara had vanished soon after, and no one had seen or heard from her again. The townsfolk remembered the sudden disappearance as strange, but at the time, no one thought to ask questions. The Dyers, after all, were good people. But now, with the sheriff's growing investigation, those same people were starting to connect the dots. The young girl had been the first victim in what would become a long line of disappearances, each one tied to the dark practices of the Dyer family. The more the sheriff dug, the more his suspicions grew. Lydia's behavior had been anything but random. Clara hadn't simply disappeared. She had been chosen. She had been brought into the Dyer household for a purpose, and that purpose, horrifyingly, had something to do with the rituals Lydia had been performing in the woods. The sheriff's stomach churned as he realized the truth, that Clara was the first of many, and the Dyer family's involvement in her death went far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The darkness surrounding the Dyers was beginning to unfurl, and the sheriff could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a family hiding behind a facade of normalcy. This was something much more insidious, something that had been buried for years. And the sheriff was beginning to fear that whatever lay at the heart of it would be far worse than he could ever have prepared for. The sheriff spent hours combing through the Dyer family's house, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the old yellowed papers. Charles and Lydia Dyer had kept everything, from family letters to medical records, all tucked away in a series of musty locked boxes in the attic. The house was filled with the smell of stale air, and the weight of time seemed to hang in every room. But it was here, in the hidden crevice of a faded trunk, that the sheriff found the records that would unravel everything. The first pages he pulled from the box were simple journals, written by Lydia herself. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary notes on gardening, church sermons, and daily household tasks. But the deeper the sheriff read, the more the unease settled in his stomach. The entries were sporadic, often in a hastily scrawled hand, as if Lydia had written them in fits of agitation. As he read further, the words became more disturbing. Details about strange rituals, odd ceremonies performed in the dead of night, under the cover of darkness. The journals spoke of practices Lydia had learned from someone she never named, someone who had taught her the ways of preserving the body, a practice that went beyond ordinary mortuary care. One journal entry stood out: "The alchemy of death is delicate but powerful. The body must be preserved in the moment of transition, before the soul leaves. Only then can it be kept from decay." The sheriff felt a shiver crawl up his spine as he read the words. Lydia had written about her experiments in preserving the body after death, using alchemical methods that seemed almost supernatural in nature. According to the journals, she had sought to freeze the moment of death, to hold on to life for just a little longer, in an effort to defy nature's inevitable course. It wasn't enough to simply embalm the body. Lydia believed that to truly preserve life, she had to capture the moment when the soul left the body and hold it there, suspended in time. As the sheriff read on, the scope of the family's obsession with death began to crystallize. Clara's body, the first victim, had been one of their early tests. The girl's death had been manipulated, Lydia's journal explained, and her body preserved using the strange rituals Lydia had learned. Clara's spirit was weak, but the body held strong. It resisted decay. We will learn much from her. The sheriff recoiled at the thought of the poor girl being treated like an experiment, her suffering never having been acknowledged by those who were meant to care for her. The deeper the sheriff dug into the journals, the more he realized how methodical the Dyers had been in their twisted practices. Clara had not been the only one to suffer at their hands. Each of the coffins in the cellar was part of a chilling tradition, each one carefully prepared, each body subjected to the same ritual. The family had kept detailed notes on every preservation, recording how long it took for each body to resist decay, what methods were most effective, and, disturbingly, the psychological effects of keeping the dead alive in this unnatural state. The sheriff's blood ran cold as he realized the family had been performing these rituals for years. their obsession with defying death evolving into something far darker than he had ever imagined. One entry described a practice referred to as the silence, a ritual Lydia performed alone. It involved placing a newly preserved body into a coffin and sealing it tight. The family believed that the act of sealing the body in silence somehow extended its life, preserving it further, as if the absence of sound, of life itself, could hold death at bay. The sheriff felt a deep, unsettling chill as he read those words. The coffins in the cellar were not merely containers for the dead, they were vessels for something else. Something the Dyers had believed could be kept, frozen, suspended, forever. As he turned the last few pages of the journals, the sheriff's hands shook, his breath coming in short gasps. He had found what he was searching for, but it had led him to a place far worse than he could have ever imagined. Lydia's writings revealed a twisted obsession, a methodical ritualistic practice that blurred the line between life and death. The Dyer family had not been preserving the dead. They had been attempting to capture the very essence of life itself, using alchemy and ancient rituals to hold it in place, to freeze the moment of death. And as the sheriff closed the journals, his mind raced with the horrifying realization that the Dyers had gone far beyond preserving bodies. They had been trying to hold on to something far more elusive, the soul. The walls of the Dyer house seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the suffocating weight of everything he had uncovered. The sheriff stood frozen, unable to escape the images of Clara, of the bodies in the coffins, of the twisted rituals that had been carried out in the name of preserving life. The darkness surrounding the Dyer family was not just buried in the past. It was still alive, still breathing, waiting to be unearthed. And he was only just beginning to understand the depths of its horror. The sheriff's investigation led him further into the town's past, where stories began to surface, carrying on whispers that had festered for years. The townspeople had always been wary of the Dyer family, but their suspicions were buried under the veneer of respectability Robert Dyer had once cultivated. To the unknowing, Robert was just another doctor in the small town, a quiet man with steady hands who offered help when the sick came knocking. But beneath the surface of his medical practice there had been something much darker, something that the sheriff could no longer ignore. As he dug deeper, the sheriff uncovered unsettling details of Robert's experiments, ones that the townspeople had whispered about but dared not confront. Robert's interest had strayed far from simple remedies. He had begun to explore the forbidden, the science of life and death, pushing the boundaries of morality and reason. There were rumors, vague but persistent, of patients who came to him for treatment and were never seen again. It was the whispers about Robert's true nature that caught the sheriff's attention. Many of the town's older residents spoke in quiet tones about Lydia Dyer's husband with a mixture of fear and revulsion. It wasn't just his practice of medicine that had made the townsfolk uneasy. It was the strange, often unexplainable methods he employed. The sheriff gathered reports from people who had seen Robert late at night, carrying strange bundles wrapped in cloth, disappearing into the woods. Others recalled seeing him speaking to shadowed figures under the cover of darkness, exchanging strange items. But it was the mention of Mary, a girl from the nearby river, that truly made the sheriff pause. Mary had been an orphan, a child who had lived with distant relatives, never quite fitting in. She had gone missing one summer and was found days later, her body floating near the riverbank. It was a tragedy, but nothing more at the time, until the sheriff pieced together the connection. Mary had been one of Robert's patients, one of his experiments. Some old-timers remembered her sudden change in behavior before her disappearance. She had become distant, her eyes empty, her speech slurred. They spoke of how she had been taken in by the Dyers, and then shortly after her body had turned up, lifeless in the water. Though the town had accepted her death as an unfortunate drowning, the sheriff knew better now. It wasn't an accident, it was the result of Robert's twisted obsession with life and death. He had experimented on her, just as he had done with others. Robert Dyer's medical practice was never about healing. It was about control. His true interest lay in the preservation of life, in halting death itself. He had used human bodies as vessels for his gruesome work, attempting to reverse the natural order, using methods that went beyond simple medicine. The sheriff's mind raced with the implications. Mary had been the first victim, a test subject for a twisted ritualistic practice that had only grown darker with time. Her death, along with the others that followed, had been part of Robert's secret pursuit of immortality. The sheriff's stomach turned as he stood in the town square, realizing the depth of the Dyer family's depravity. Lydia had not simply inherited Robert's legacy. She had continued it, hidden in plain sight. The truth was darker than he could have imagined, and as the sheriff looked back toward the Dyer estate, he knew that this was just the beginning of the horrors yet to be uncovered. The sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeper than the horrific rituals he had uncovered. The Dyer estate felt alive in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the family's twisted practices that unnerved him now. It was the strange phenomena that began to follow him, things he couldn't dismiss as mere coincidence. At night, the house seemed to hum with a quiet, unsettling energy, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets. He'd hear soft rustling sounds like distant footsteps on the creaky wooden floor, faint voices murmuring just out of earshot. When he would rush to check, no one would be there. It started subtly, small things, books misplaced, windows left open that he knew had been shut. Then the sounds became louder. The sheriff awoke one night to hear a scraping sound coming from downstairs, the unmistakable noise of something dragging across the floor. He crept down the stairs, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and found the source. An old chair, slowly rocking back and forth on its own. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and he felt a cold chill sweep through the room. No explanation, just the feeling that something or someone was present in the house with him. The sheriff couldn't bring himself to dismiss it. This house, this family, had seen horrors beyond the understanding of ordinary men, and the deeper he dug, the more his own sense of reality began to warp. It wasn't just the rituals, the symbols carved into bodies, or the way the Dyer family had twisted the natural order of life and death. It was the very air around him that seemed to bend, as if the laws of nature had been violated too many times within these walls. Could the Dyers have truly crossed into something darker? Had their experiments, their rituals, somehow opened a door to a realm beyond the living? He confided his concerns to Jacob, but the deputy, even the skeptic, didn't seem as disturbed. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you, Sheriff," Jacob said, trying to offer reassurance. "You've uncovered a lot. It's bound to take its toll." But the sheriff wasn't so sure. As the days passed, the strange occurrences increased. In the middle of the night, he would feel as though eyes were watching him, cold, unblinking. His own reflection in the mirror would seem to flicker, as if another presence was lurking just behind him. And worse, in the deepest recesses of his mind, he began to hear a voice, soft, coaxing, seductive, calling him toward the cellar. It wasn't a voice that came from the walls, but one that seemed to come from inside his own skull, urging him to come closer, to uncover more, to uncover it all. The deeper the sheriff investigated, the more terrifying the Dyer family's rituals seemed. He pieced together the truth that Lydia had tried so hard to bury. The Dyers didn't just kill their victims, they chose them. These weren't random deaths. They were part of a deliberate, calculated process. The victims were meant to serve, to enter into the Dyer family's twisted circle of eternity. It wasn't just about preservation. It was about making a connection to the dead, binding their souls into the living world, forcing them to remain in a state of suspended decay, neither truly dead nor alive. The Dyer family believed that by incorporating the spirits of their victims into the cycle, they could achieve immortality, ensuring their influence lived on long after their bodies decayed. The sheriff felt his mind begin to unravel as the weight of what he had discovered pressed down on him. He had thought the family's rituals were about controlling death, about keeping the dead from decaying. But now, he realized with sickening clarity, it was much worse. The Dyers had sought to become something more, something that existed beyond the bounds of life and death. Their experiments weren't just grotesque. They were attempts to break the natural order itself, to tether the dead to the world of the living, forever. As he stood in the center of the Dyer estate, the whispering grew louder, as though the house itself was urging him to join the circle. The walls seemed to pulse with unseen energy, and the air was thick with the weight of countless souls, trapped in a state of suspended existence. The sheriff could feel his resolve slipping, his thoughts becoming clouded, as if something powerful, was drawing him deeper into Dyer's world. The truth was clear now. The Dyer family had not only been attempting to defy death, they had been inviting it to take a permanent place within their lives. And as the sheriff stepped back, shuddering with a deep primal fear, he realized that he was now tangled in their web. The Dyer's power, whether supernatural or psychological, had begun to seep into his own mind, and there was no turning back. Jonathan Dyer had always lived in the shadows of his parents, a figure barely seen, more a ghost than a man. As a child, he had been shaped by the twisted practices of his mother Lydia and his father Robert, both of whom had passed away years ago. But the legacy they had left behind, the rituals, the dark obsession with death, had followed Jonathan into his adulthood like an unshakable shadow. He was not a leader like his father, nor a visionary like his mother. He was a follower, caught in the web of their madness, unable to escape the very practices he had been born into. Now, an older man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes, Jonathan lived alone in the family estate, the crumbling mansion that had once been filled with life but now echoed only with memories of darkness. The town had long since stopped speaking of him. He was a recluse, a forgotten relic of a bygone era, too consumed by guilt and sorrow to show his face in public. But that didn't mean the past had stopped haunting him. Every inch of the estate held the weight of his family's legacy, the heavy air of death, the oppressive silence, the stillness of the coffins in the cellar. They were his burden now. The sheriff had come to the estate following the trail of his investigation, but when Jonathan greeted him at the door, there was no hostility, no defiance, just a sense of resignation, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. The sheriff could see it in Jonathan's eyes, the same haunted look he had seen in the faces of those who had witnessed the horrors of the Dyer family's rituals. It was a look that spoke of guilt, of remorse, of a soul crushed under the weight of what had been done. "I've been waiting for you," Jonathan said, his voice quiet but steady, as if there was nothing left to hide. The sheriff, surprised by the lack of resistance, stepped inside the mansion, his eyes scanning the familiar but faded surroundings. The walls, once elegant, were now covered in layers of dust. The air felt thick with sorrow, as though the house itself was mourning. Jonathan led the sheriff to the cellar where the coffins stood still and silent, lined up like graves awaiting their occupants. The sheriff could see now that the coffins were more than just remnants of the past. They were Jonathan's way of holding on to what he had lost, his parents, the family he could never escape. He had inherited their obsession, their need to preserve the dead, and now, in the silence of his solitude, he had carried it on. "I never wanted this," Jonathan said, his voice breaking as he stood before the coffins. "But I couldn't stop it. After they were gone, I was left with nothing but this need to keep them close. The rituals, the preservation. It's all I had left of them, of my parents." The sheriff watched him, his heart heavy with pity. Jonathan wasn't a monster. He wasn't a maniac like his parents had been. He was a broken man, a victim of his own upbringing. The horrors he had helped perpetuate had left him with no place to go, no way to live. His father's experiments, his mother's dark obsession with life and death had poisoned him in ways that could never be undone. And now all he had left were the coffins, each one a testament to the family he could never leave behind. "There's no redemption for me," Jonathan whispered him, his hands trembling as he reached for one of the coffins. "I couldn't save them, couldn't stop them, and now I can't stop myself." The sheriff could see it in Jonathan's eyes. He was trapped in the legacy of his parents' madness, unable to escape the very thing that had consumed his family for generations. The guilt was etched into every line on his face, every frail movement. He wasn't just haunted by the past, he was living in it, trapped in a cycle of preservation, of holding on to the dead as if they could somehow come back. "I didn't want to become them," Jonathan continued, his voice barely a whisper. "But I did. I became a part of it, and now I have no choice." The circle is complete. The sheriff felt the weight of Jonathan's sorrow pressing down on him. The legacy of the Dyer family's twisted rituals had claimed another victim. Jonathan was a man broken by the sins of his parents, a man who could never escape the darkness they had passed down to him. And as the sheriff stood there, helpless to undo the damage, he knew that the Dyer family's curse would never be fully broken, not as long as Jonathan Dyer remained bound to the past. The sheriff's investigation into the Dyer family's rituals had unearthed horrors far beyond what he had imagined. It wasn't just the preservation of the dead. It was something much more sinister, an attempt to transcend death entirely. The Dyers weren't trying to halt decay or preserve life for a fleeting moment. They sought immortality. What began as a twisted obsession with preserving the dead had morphed into something darker, a grotesque experiment in which death itself was defied and life was distorted beyond recognition. Lydia's journals spoke of alchemical substances, concoctions designed to replace the vital organs of the human body with unnatural materials. These flesh bounds, as she called them, were meant to prevent the body from decaying by freezing it in a state of eternal stasis. The sheriff could hardly believe what he was reading. Organs were removed and replaced, not just to preserve life, but to create something beyond the natural order. It was not about life or death. It was about control, about defying nature's course. But it was Jonathan's actions that turned the sheriff's stomach. The sheriff had assumed that Jonathan's participation in his parents' rituals had been out of guilt, a twisted desire to hold on to his family's legacy. But the truth was far worse. Jonathan wasn't merely carrying on his parents' work. He had become something worse, a willing participant in the gruesome experiments, one who had begun to experiment on the living. The people who had gone missing, orphans, runaways, the vulnerable, had been brought to the Dyer estate, where their bodies were subjected to the same horrific treatment that had been performed on Clara and others before her. Jonathan's obsession had grown darker over time. He wasn't satisfied with merely preserving the dead. He sought to create life from the dead, to forge a new existence where decay was no longer possible. The flesh-bound were not just bodies preserved in a lifeless state. They were experiments, twisted creations of flesh and unnatural substances, neither truly alive nor truly dead. Jonathan had turned his family's legacy into an ongoing nightmare, one that no longer involved the preservation of life, but the creation of abominations. The sheriff felt a wave of disgust wash over him. Jonathan's experiments had gone too far. He was no longer just a man haunted by his parents' legacy. He was now the architect of an even more grotesque future. The sheriff knew now that Jonathan had no intention of stopping. The price of immortality, it seemed, was the very soul of anyone who dared to pursue it, and Jonathan had already paid that price. The sheriff's hand gripped the banister as he descended into the Dyer family's cellar, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Behind him, Jacob followed, the unease in the air palpable. Every breath the sheriff took felt heavier than the last, the stench of decay mixing with something colder, something more unnatural. It was as if the house itself was watching them, waiting for them to uncover the final terrible truth. The darkness in this place was not just in the walls, it was in the very air they breathed. The sheriff's mind raced with the horrors he had uncovered so far. Jonathan Dyer, the last of the family, had carried on his parents' grotesque experiments, preserving the dead, replacing organs, seeking immortality. But it was what he had done to the living that truly haunted him. The young man they had discovered, dragged from the nearby town, was only the latest victim in a long line of human experiments, his body slowly being transformed into something unnatural by the twisted hands of Jonathan. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the sheriff stopped dead. The faint sound of murmuring reached his ears, low and rhythmic. Jonathan's voice, the air seemed to vibrate with it, an unsettling chant that sent shivers crawling up his spine. The sheriff motioned for Jacob to stay behind him as he stepped forward. His eyes fell upon Jonathan, who stood before one of the coffins, preparing another victim. The young man lay motionless, his body pale, the faint rise and fall of his chest the only sign that he was still alive. Jonathan, oblivious to their approach, muttered incantations under his breath as he removed organs, replaced them with something else, something alien to the human body. The sheriff's heart raced as he watched Jonathan work. The rituals he had uncovered in Lydia's journals flashed through his mind, the flesh-bound, the twisted alchemical processes meant to halt decay, to freeze death in its tracks. But here, before him, was the true horror. Not just a ritual, but a living nightmare, an experiment in progress. "Jonathan!" The sheriff's voice cut through the murmur, sharp with authority. Jonathan froze, his hand still hovering over the lifeless body. He slowly turned to face them, the faintest smile curling on his lips as though he'd been expecting this moment all along. "I knew you would come," Jonathan said, his voice distant, almost as though he were speaking through a fog. His eyes, however, were unnervingly clear. There was no remorse, no recognition of the terrible consequences of his actions. There was only an unsettling calm, as though he had long since resigned himself to his path. "You don't have to do this anymore," Jacob urged, stepping forward, his voice shaking. "This isn't who you are." Jonathan's smile faltered, but only slightly. "You don't understand," he whispered, his hands trembling as they hovered over the body. "I've tried to stop. But they—" His voice broke. "This is the only way to keep them with me, to preserve them." The sheriff's heart clenched with sorrow, but there was no time for pity now. Jonathan wasn't the man he once was. He was a broken reflection of his parents' twisted legacy. The sheriff's gaze hardened, his hand moving to his holster, his mind made up. Jonathan's madness had gone too far. Jonathan's eyes widened as the sheriff raised his weapon, the realization sinking in. "No," Jonathan whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't understand. I have to—" The sheriff's shot rang out, silencing Jonathan before the last word could leave his mouth. He collapsed to the floor, his body crumpling in defeat, but his face still twisted with that final maddening smile. Jacob stood still, his eyes wide with disbelief. The sheriff lowered his weapon slowly, his breath ragged. The fight was over, but the sorrow remained, weighing heavily in the air. Jonathan Dyer, like his parents before him, had been consumed by his own darkness. And now the legacy of the Dyer family's horrors was at an end. The sheriff stood over the body, his heart heavy with the knowledge that no one had truly won. Jonathan was gone, but the Dyer family's legacy would haunt the town for generations. The horrors of their rituals, their pursuit of immortality, would never be forgotten. And as the silence settled over the cellar, the sheriff knew that the cost of immortality had been paid, not just in lives, but in the very souls of the Dyer family. The moment of reckoning had come, and it had been as tragic as it was inevitable. The sheriff stood in the town square, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like the heavy fog that had settled over the town in the days since Jonathan Dyer's death. The Dyer estate had been razed to the ground, flames licking at the night sky, consuming the house that had been the cradle of so much horror. The town's officials had ordered it. Burn the house, burn the legacy, erase the past. The sheriff had been there, watching as the flames engulfed the remnants of the Dyer family's twisted history. But as the fire burned, so did the last remnants of the truth. The legacy of the Dyers wasn't something that could be erased so easily, no matter how many bricks turned to ash. The townspeople had rallied around the idea of erasing the family's memory, pushing to forget the atrocities that had taken place behind the walls of that mansion. But for the sheriff, there was no forgetting. No matter how much the town tried to bury it, the truth about the Dyers lingered. An unspoken history that could never be fully erased, no matter how many fires were lit to cleanse the past. The evil of the Dyer family wasn't just in the acts they committed. It was in the silence that had allowed them to continue unchecked for so long. No one had wanted to see what lay beneath the surface. And when the truth finally came to light, it had been too much to bear. The sheriff understood that better than anyone. Evil doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it hides behind the veil of normalcy, lurking just out of sight, waiting for its chance to strike. The town's officials spoke of closure, of healing, but the sheriff could feel the underlying tension. The burning of the estate wasn't a fresh start. It was an attempt to silence a truth that could not be silenced. The people of the town wanted to move on, to pretend that the horrors of the Dyer family had never happened. But the sheriff knew better. The evil that had taken root in the Dyer house had been part of the town's history for far too long. It couldn't be buried in the ashes. In the days that followed, a memorial was erected in the town square, a stone marker to honor those who had died at the hands of the Dyers. The townspeople gathered around it, paying their respects as if that would somehow make things right. But the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something crucial. There were no names on the memorial, no mention of the Dyer family's twisted legacy. The town had chosen to forget, to bury the truth beneath a facade of healing. But the sheriff knew the truth could never be buried. It would always find a way to resurface, to haunt them in the quiet moments when they thought they had moved on. As the sheriff walked away from the memorial, his footsteps heavy, he couldn't help but reflect on what had truly been lost. The town wanted peace, but peace had come at a price. The truth of the Dyer family's evil would never be fully acknowledged, and in that silence, the true cost of their legacy remained. The sheriff could only hope that the town would eventually come to understand. Some things can't be silenced. Some evils can never truly be erased. Decades passed, and the town grew quiet again. The charred remains of the Dyer estate had long since been cleared away, and the once grand mansion was little more than a memory, its stones and timbers reduced to dust. The fire that had consumed it was meant to be an end, a final purge of the evil that had festered within. But even after all these years, the legacy of the Dyer family continued to cast a long shadow over the town. Though the people tried to move on, to rebuild their lives and forget the horrors that had unfolded so many years ago, there were those who couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. Visitors to the Dyer estate, now nothing more than a vast empty lot overrun by weeds, often spoke of a strange presence. Some claimed to feel eyes watching them, an unseen force that seemed to press against their chest, a weight they couldn't explain. Others swore they heard whispers in the wind, hushed voices carried on the breeze, though no one was there to speak to them. The town itself had grown quieter with time. New families had moved in, businesses had reopened, and the streets once again bustled with life. But the memories of the Dyer family's madness never fully faded. There was always a part of the town that carried the burden of their dark history. People spoke of the Dyer family only in hushed tones, as if saying their name out loud might summon something far worse. For those who had lived through it, the sheriff, now an old man, and a few others who remembered the horrors, the shadow of the Dyers still loomed. The sheriff had grown weary with age, his hair now white, his hands trembling as he walked the streets he had once patrolled with authority. But the events of the past still weighed heavily on him. He had done what he could to end the madness, but the legacy of the Dyer family could never truly be erased. The horrors they had unleashed had touched too many lives, and their influence lingered like an open wound that had never fully healed. One late afternoon, the sheriff found himself standing at the edge of the town's graveyard, looking out at the weathered headstones that marked the resting places of the Dyer family. The town had long since forgotten the details of their lives, and even the sheriff had never spoken of it aloud again. But now, standing in the graveyard, the memories rushed back in a flood. He thought of Jonathan, of Lydia, of Robert, and of the victims whose names would never be known. He stepped slowly toward the Dyer family's graves, the ground uneven beneath his feet. The air was heavy with the passage of time, the weight of years pressing against him. The graves were worn, the stones cracked, but they still stood as a testament to the twisted legacy that had once held the town in its grip. The sheriff reached out, his fingers grazing the cold, weathered stone. He wasn't sure if he was seeking closure or simply honoring the past. But as he stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of the Dyer family, a shiver ran down his spine. In the quiet of the graveyard, he could almost hear the whispers again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. The shadows of the past hadn't gone away. They never would. The Dyer family's legacy, for all its horrors, was forever a part of the town's dark history. The sheriff stood alone, feeling the weight of his years and the weight of what had been lost. And as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the graveyard, he knew that despite the passage of time, some things never truly leave us. They remain, lingering in the dark corners of memory, haunting us forever. The world moves on, as it always does. The townspeople, after years of whispers and fears, gradually shifted their gaze away from the ruins of the Dyer estate. Life began to settle into a dull, predictable rhythm once more. The streets were no longer haunted by the echoes of what had happened, and the scar the Dyer family had left on the town seemed to heal, at least on the surface. But beneath that fragile veneer of normalcy, something had been irrevocably changed. The sheriff, now older, could feel the passage of time like a weight pressing against his chest. He'd watched the town grow, watched people come and go, but the questions about the Dyer family's legacy remained unresolved, hanging in the air like a fog that wouldn't lift. The authorities had done what they could. The Dyer estate had been burned, the history buried, the bodies laid to rest. Laws were amended, ethics were debated, and committees were formed in the aftermath of the horrors uncovered. But even as the world moved on, the true depth of the suffering inflicted by the Dyer family was left to rot in the dark corners of memory, far from the eyes of the public. The sheriff found himself reflecting on the nature of evil, its ability to hide in plain sight. The Dyer family had been accepted as ordinary, as part of the fabric of the town. They had played their roles, kept their distance, and no one had questioned what lay beneath the surface. They were a quiet family involved in the community, their reputation untainted. But the reality, as the sheriff knew all too well, was that evil doesn't always wear the mask of violence or chaos. Sometimes it's hidden behind a facade of normalcy, of respectability. It takes time for the cracks to show, for the rot to become undeniable. And even then, when the truth finally emerges, it often comes too late, after the damage has been done. The sheriff could not help but wonder how many more families, how many more people, had lived in the same kind of quiet terror as the Dyer family's victims. How many towns had been like his, where evil had been buried, where the darkness had seeped in slowly, insidiously, until it was too ingrained to recognize. How many more horrors were waiting, hidden under the skin of everyday life, waiting for the right moment to emerge. There were no answers to these questions, no tidy resolutions. The full extent of the Dyer family's madness had never been fully understood by anyone except those who had lived through it, and even then, the scars they left behind were too deep to be healed. The sheriff had tried to do what he could, to stop the horrors before they consumed more lives, but in the end, he knew that it wasn't just about stopping the Dyers, it was about understanding the nature of evil itself. Its ability to infect and spread, to bury itself in the darkest corners of our society so that we don't see it until it's too late. The world had learned from the Dyer family's atrocities. Laws were changed, procedures were tightened, and the ethics of medicine and science were scrutinized more than ever before. But the sheriff knew that no amount of legal change could fully cleanse the stain the Dyers had left behind. Some things could never be fully undone. Their legacy would live on in whispers, in hushed conversations, in the lives of those who had been forever altered by what had happened. The sheriff stood at the edge of the town square, looking out over the quiet streets that had once been so full of fear. The past was buried now, hidden beneath the layers of time, but the question lingered in his mind just as it always had. What's left behind? The answer, as the sheriff knew, was both simple and complex. What was left behind were the scars, the ones that can never be erased, the ones that haunt the soul. The Dyer family had been buried, their story concealed by time, but the evil they had set into motion would never truly disappear. It would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered once again. And as the sheriff walked away, his old bones aching with the weight of it all, he turned to the audience, his voice barely more than a whisper. What do you think? Could this happen again? It was a question that would haunt anyone who dared to ask it. The answer, as the sheriff had learned, was as unsettling as it was inevitable. Evil never truly disappears. It only waits, watching, hiding, waiting for the right moment to return. And when it does, it will be hidden behind another mask, wearing a different face,